Air France just canceled every flight to Riyadh and Dubai. Not delayed, canceled. Within the same 48 hours, airlines from the United States, Canada, Germany, Hong Kong, Singapore, and the United Kingdom all made the same call, pulling their aircraft out of Middle East airspace entirely. This is not routine caution. Airlines do not abandon some of the busiest, most profitable air corridors on the planet unless their own risk models are telling them something the public statements out of Washington and Tehran are not saying directly. And at the exact same moment those cancellations were going out, the United States quietly began flying in additional F-16 and F-35 fighter jets, along with a fresh wave of aerial refueling tankers, into bases across the region. Something is building. And the airline industry may be reading it faster than anyone. Here is exactly where this war stands right now, because the pace of escalation over just the last several days has been extraordinary. The United States has now launched strikes against Iran for 9 consecutive nights. Iranian state media reported a fresh American missile strike near Abadan, in Iran's southwest, on the 9th night alone. According to Iran's own health ministry, at least 12 people were killed by U.S. strikes in a single day, pushing the total death toll since this latest phase of the war began past 50. Iran has responded by launching missiles and drones at American bases across the Gulf, and its Revolutionary Guard has struck targets in Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, Jordan, and Syria in direct retaliation for the American campaign. On the most recent night, Iran fired missiles specifically toward the Jordanian city of Aqaba, an attack that came dangerously close to Israeli territory, close enough that Israel's own air defenses reportedly took part in intercepting some of the incoming missiles alongside Jordan's. Now, picture what 9 consecutive nights of this actually looks like from inside the region, because the numbers alone do not capture the scale. Kuwaiti authorities have reported significant damage to a vital site in the country's oil sector following repeated Iranian attacks, along with several injuries. A desalination plant in Kuwait, critical infrastructure providing drinking water to the population, was hit directly. This is not a war being fought exclusively between military targets anymore. It is a war whose consequences are landing on the basic infrastructure ordinary people in multiple countries depend on to survive: water, electricity, oil revenue, all of it now sitting inside the blast radius of a conflict most of these countries never chose to be part of. This is exactly why the airline cancellations matter so much, because they represent an independent, commercially driven risk assessment running in parallel to the military and political statements. Airlines do not make decisions like halting service to Riyadh and Dubai lightly. These are among the busiest transit hubs in the entire world, connecting Europe, Asia, and the Americas through Gulf carriers that rely on that traffic for enormous revenue. When 6 or more major international carriers from 6 different countries independently reach the same conclusion within the same narrow window, it tells you their internal risk models, built on data most of the public never sees directly, are flashing red simultaneously. This is the aviation industry's own version of a satellite image, a visible, undeniable signal of how seriously professionals inside this specific industry are treating the risk of continued or expanded conflict. Now bring in what the United States military itself is doing in parallel, because the buildup happening quietly in the background tells a story just as significant as the airline cancellations. According to a U.S. official, additional F-16 and F-35 fighter jets are being sent from bases in Europe into the Middle East, alongside more aerial refueling tankers. During the earlier opening phase of this war back in March, roughly 94 refueling tankers supported American operations in the region. That number had dropped to around 40 as the conflict cooled following the initial ceasefire, but has been climbing again over the past week, according to an Israeli source tracking the deployment. Dozens of additional tankers have already arrived in Israel, with more still incoming. This is not the posture of a military preparing to wind a conflict down. This is the posture of a military preparing for the possibility that the next phase of this war requires significantly more sustained air power than the current campaign has needed so far. This is exactly the trap sitting underneath this entire moment. Every one of these signals, the airline cancellations, the fighter jet deployments, the refueling tanker buildup, is happening quietly, without the kind of dramatic public announcement that accompanied earlier phases of this war. Nobody in Washington has declared a new offensive. Nobody in Tehran has declared a new phase of retaliation beyond what is already underway. And yet the practical, on-the-ground indicators, the ones that professionals in aviation and defense logistics actually rely on rather than political statements, are all pointing in the same direction, toward expansion, not resolution. Let's widen the lens, because this specific moment sits at the intersection of nearly every major thread running through this entire war right now. Start with Israel's own position, because it has remained formally on the sidelines of this latest 9-night American strike campaign, despite its earlier direct involvement in what the U.S. military called Operation Epic Fury back in the war's opening weeks. Iran has not attempted to launch attacks on Israel directly during this current phase, but has repeatedly warned any country helping the United States that it would face consequences as well, a warning that grows more urgent every time Iranian missiles land closer to Israeli territory, as they did with the recent strike toward Aqaba in Jordan. Israel's defense minister, Israel Katz, made Israel's own position explicit over the weekend, stating flatly that if Iran attacks Israel, the country will respond and strike back without any dependence or conditions. Israel's military chief of staff went even further, saying the country's forces are prepared to immediately resume combat and will act with great determination against anyone who harms them. Israel is not currently fighting, but every statement coming out of its defense establishment right now reads like a country expecting that to change very soon. Now bring in the diplomatic track, because it has not actually disappeared, even as the military escalation continues night after night. Iran maintains that diplomatic efforts are ongoing through mediators, even while its own army spokesman insists the war will continue until adequate deterrence against further attacks has been achieved. In a separate, wide-ranging interview, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made an admission that reveals just how unusual this moment inside Iran's own government actually is. He acknowledged that the security failures, which allowed the devastating opening strikes of this war, still exist. He said Iran must be willing to negotiate if achieving what he called absolute military victory proves impossible, though he insisted any talks should happen only once Iran holds what he described as the upper hand. And then came the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Araghchi admitted he has still not personally met Iran's own new supreme leader. Sit with that for a moment, because it is one of the most revealing details to emerge from this entire war. Iran's own foreign minister, the man leading the country's diplomatic strategy during the most consequential conflict the Islamic Republic has faced in decades, has not yet had a face-to-face meeting with the man who now holds ultimate authority over that same strategy. This is not a minor bureaucratic oversight. It is a direct window into just how chaotic and improvised Iran's own wartime leadership structure remains, weeks after a rushed succession installed a new supreme leader who has still not appeared publicly in any meaningful capacity. Araghchi is formulating Iran's negotiating position, deciding when the country has enough leverage to sit down with Washington, without direct guidance from the one figure constitutionally empowered to set that strategy. Iran is, in a very real sense, fighting and negotiating this war on partial autopilot. Now zoom out to the broader regional picture, because the spillover from this conflict keeps widening in ways that connect almost every country in the region simultaneously. Iran struck Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, Jordan, and Syria in direct retaliation for American strikes, a target list spanning 5 separate nations, none of which are the primary combatant in this war. Kuwait has absorbed direct damage to its oil sector and its water infrastructure. Jordan intercepted missiles fired toward Aqaba, coming close enough to Israeli territory that Israel's own defenses joined in the interception. Lebanon sits in its own delicate position, with Secretary of State Marco Rubio meeting Lebanese President Joseph Aoun in Washington, specifically to discuss a recent agreement between Israel, the United States, and Lebanon, even as Air France extends its suspension of flights to Beirut through early August. Every one of these countries is being pulled deeper into a conflict shaped almost entirely by decisions made in Washington and Tehran. Let's zoom out even further, because this war is not simply escalating within its own borders. It is actively degrading the infrastructure that connects this region to the rest of the world. Satellite imagery has already revealed strikes on Iran's largest nuclear power plant during a recent window of fighting, and separately close observers have noted that the Strait of Hormuz is unlikely to ever fully return to its pre-war state, regardless of how this specific phase of the conflict eventually resolves. Analysts tracking the American campaign describe its goals as ranging from disrupting Iran's supply lines to directly curbing its influence over that critical waterway. This is not a war being fought simply to punish a single provocation. It is a war being fought, at least in part, to permanently reshape the balance of power over one of the most important strategic choke points on the planet. Now consider what this means for each of the parties now navigating this specific moment. For the United States, the airline cancellations and expanding fighter jet deployment suggest a military establishment preparing for a campaign that may need to sustain itself for considerably longer than 9 nights, rather than winding down toward any near-term resolution. For Iran, the admission from its own foreign minister that he has not yet met the new supreme leader reveals a government trying to project strength and continuity to the outside world, while privately still working out its own basic chain of command during the most dangerous period the regime has faced in decades. For Israel, remaining formally uninvolved while simultaneously issuing some of the starkest warnings of the entire war suggests a country calculating that its own re-entry into active combat may not be a matter of if, but simply of when the right trigger and attack on its own soil actually arrives. There is also a mechanical detail behind these airline decisions worth understanding, because it explains why the cancellations happened as quickly and as broadly as they did. Commercial aviation insurers reassess war risk premiums for specific airspace almost continuously during active conflicts. And those premiums can spike dramatically within hours of new intelligence about missile activity, air defense engagements, or expanded strike campaigns. When premiums rise past a certain threshold, airlines face a direct financial calculation, absorb the dramatically higher cost of continued operation, or suspend service until the underlying risk picture improves. 6 or more major carriers reaching that same threshold within the same narrow window suggests the underlying war risk data feeding those insurance markets moved sharply and simultaneously, a far more objective signal than any single government's public statement about the state of the conflict. Now consider what this means for the broader economic picture across the Gulf, beyond simply the inconvenience of canceled flights. Dubai and Riyadh function as critical global aviation hubs, connecting passenger and cargo traffic between Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Extended disruption to that traffic does not just affect airline revenue. It ripples into tourism, business travel, and cargo logistics across dozens of countries that rely on those specific transit routes, adding cost and delay to global supply chains at a moment when energy markets are already absorbing the shock of a shipping strait that analysts increasingly believe may never fully return to its pre-war operating conditions. This is how a regional war, even one not directly targeting global trade infrastructure, ends up reshaping economic patterns far outside the immediate conflict zone. There is also the question of how long airlines typically maintain these kinds of suspensions once war risk assessments trigger them, based on patterns from other recent conflicts. Extended flight suspensions, the kind stretching into weeks rather than days, as with the Beirut suspension already extended into August, tend to reflect a judgment that the underlying conflict lacks any clear near-term resolution. Airlines are, in effect, telling their own customers and shareholders that they do not expect meaningful improvement in regional safety conditions within the coming weeks, a judgment that carries real weight given how much financial and reputational risk these companies bear if they are proven wrong in either direction. For Gulf states like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and Jordan, the calculation is almost entirely defensive at this point, absorbing damage from a conflict they have no meaningful ability to influence, while watching international airlines make the same judgment about regional risk that their own governments have been managing on the ground for months. And for ordinary people across every one of these countries, families in Kuwait dealing with damaged water infrastructure, travelers across multiple continents finding their flights through Gulf hubs, suddenly canceled residents in southwestern Iran near Abadan, absorbing the 9th consecutive night of American strikes. This war continues generating consequences that have almost nothing to do with the strategic calculations driving it, and almost everything to do with simply being in the wrong place while two governments continue trading blows. This is where the deeper danger of this specific moment comes into focus. Every individual signal, the airline cancellations, the fighter jet buildup, the rising tanker numbers, Israel's escalating rhetoric, Iran's own admitted internal disarray, could plausibly be explained away on its own as a cautious, defensive measure rather than evidence of imminent dramatic expansion. But taken together, across the same narrow window of days, they paint a picture that is considerably harder to dismiss. Multiple independent actors, airlines making commercial risk assessments, military planners, repositioning combat aircraft, defense ministers, issuing pointed public warnings, all appear to be preparing for the same possibility simultaneously, that this war is not winding toward its 9th night plateau, but building toward something considerably larger. Consider what would have to happen for that expansion to actually materialize. An Iranian strike that directly hits Israeli territory, triggering the response Katz and Kammer have both promised without conditions. A miscalculation near Aqaba or elsewhere that draws Jordan more directly into active combat rather than simply intercepting stray missiles. A decision inside Washington that 9 nights of strikes have not achieved sufficient degradation of Iran's capabilities, justifying an even larger, more sustained campaign supported by the fighter jets and tankers already arriving in the region. None of these outcomes are guaranteed, but every one of them is now sitting closer to plausible than it was even a week ago, based on the same signals airlines and military planners are already quietly acting on. Let's go back to where we started. Air France canceling flights to Riyadh and Dubai. Airlines from 6 different countries making the same call within the same narrow window. Fighter jets and refueling tankers quietly flowing back into the region at rates approaching the war's original opening phase. None of these decisions required a dramatic announcement from any government to happen. They happened because the people responsible for managing real, practical risk, airline safety officers, military logistics planners, defense ministers, speaking in blunt, conditional language, are all reading the same underlying trajectory and are all preparing for it accordingly, regardless of what the official diplomatic statements from Washington and Tehran continue to say in public. Whether this war's ninth night turns out to be close to its peak, or simply the latest marker on a path towards something considerably larger, may become clear not from the next press conference, but from how many more airlines make the same call in the days ahead. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and comment your thoughts below, so this analysis reaches more people who need to understand exactly how close this war is to expanding even further right now.